What is going on in Washington, D.C. is no less than a teachable moment. It's a moment of moral clarity, and the intended audience is the Palestinian Authority. Washington is saying, you can't pay terrorists and hope to have a peace partner called Israel and an independent entity called a Palestinian Authority or perhaps an independent sovereign entity. You cannot pay terrorists or the families of terrorists or engage in the demonization of Israel and think that you are going to have a peace agreement with your Israeli neighbor. And in fact, the United States government is putting its money where its mouth is by changing decades of diplomacy and recognizing the critical importance of Israel's united capital. And the teachable moment extends to the BDS movement. And it's not only this government and past governments, but it's the United States Congress. Both the Senate and the House have said to the BDSers, boycott, divestment, and sanction activists, radical actors who support terror groups like Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Front for Liberation of Palestine, and others. What Congress has said to them is, the United States is not going to go for this. Enough is enough. If you want peace, leaders of the Palestinian Authority and the NGOs in Ramallah, who are financed by European states, you are going to have to stop the demonization. You are going to have to back off the delegitimization of Israel. And by the way, of Jews, not only in Israel, but on university campuses across North America, who are suffering harassment, violence, intimidation. 50 governors of 50 of the United States have said no. They've followed the moral clarity of Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York. Remember what he said? He said recently, if you boycott Israel, New York will boycott you. Now that's a teachable moment. And that moment echoed to every one of the 50 governors of the United States. It's the only time in modern American history where 50 governors have taken a principled moral position on the existential position of a dear ally. And in fact, 23 of the United States have passed state laws criminalizing BDS. So the United States leadership, both its policymakers, its local leaders, its national leaders, and the United States government have understood that BDS, just like paying the terrorists and just like the Palestinian Authority demonizing Israel's own and only capital, Jerusalem, will not put up with the radicalization, the hate speech, and the affiliated violence of the BDS movement. And that's a positive development. In fact, it makes one think, have we won the war against BDS? Is it all over? We should pack up and go home. And the answer is no. I want to tell you a secret. There is a bigger battlefield when it comes to BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. There's a bigger battlefield. There's an amphibious assault going on that the U.S. Congress is less aware of. And I would argue that Jewish leadership is less aware of, and that people of goodwill, men and women, friends of Israel, people of goodwill around the world are less aware of. And that is a weapon called anti-normalization. Anti-normalization is a weapon that the Palestinian Authority leadership and those NGOs in Ramallah have used in order to stick a knife through any possibility of peaceful relations between Israelis and Palestinians. You know, denormalization, which is the Palestinian version of the anti-normalization that we saw against former apartheid rogue state South Africa of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s until apartheid ended in 1991 and then changed its government in 1994, is the middle link in a poisonous food chain. The lowest lying fruit on that food chain, BDS. the actual sanctioning, divestment, and boycotting of any company that does business with Israel or Israel itself. But it's that middle link that's the most poisonous part of the food chain. Because when you talk about anti-normalization, you're talking about treating Israel as a cancer, as a rogue state, as another version of North Korea or former apartheid South Africa, in which, if you were anything but a white person, you could not so much drink a glass of water out of the same cup as your white fellow South African. In other words, what people don't realize when they use the word apartheid against Israel as an accusation against its very existence, nothing to do with territory. The apartheid accusation and the denormalization corollary basically insist that Israel, as a cancer, the way the Iranian regime refers to the Jewish state, and the way many on college campuses, such as the Students for Justice in Palestine or the Jewish Voice for Peace, anti-Western, radical, hate-filled, extremist, terror-affiliated groups will have you believe that Israel, like apartheid South Africa, has no reason to exist. So there's our first conclusion, that denormalization of the Palestinian Authority, the leadership, and NGOs in Ramallah has nothing to do with creating a Palestinian state. It has everything to do with destroying the one and only Jewish one. And what the American Congress has done is that they've listened very well. Because if you listen to the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, of course the Hamas, Fatah, and others, the NGOs in Ramallah, you hear this zero-sum game that denormalization represents. The zero-sum game is Israel shouldn't exist. Israel's a rogue state. Now, what's crazy about that, and insufferable, and cannot be countenanced, and must be wiped out, the former apartheid regime was based on a government-sanctioned status of racial superiority, white racial superiority. Now, those of you who have been to Israel and know people who live in Israel know that, and here's a secret, Israel is a non-white majority country. The majority of Israelis come from non-European states. And here's another secret. Israel, according to law, according to its basic law, protects all minorities from its 1,250,000 Arab citizens and residents of Jerusalem and citizens of Israel who are guaranteed full equality under the law. That's why a Palestinian Supreme Court justice sent a former Israeli president to jail. That's why the leading physicians in Israel, leading lawyers, leading doctors, leading engineers, contractors, you name it, are Palestinians in Israel. That is what's called a multicultural democratic reality. Now, those that push Israel as an apartheid state and denormalization will have you believe that Israel, like former apartheid South Africa, is a white racist regime that has no interest or is not governed by human rights or civil rights. And therefore, all denormalization requires is that we unmask it. And it's not that difficult to unmask. If you listen to the statements of the Palestinian Authority leadership, you can begin to peel away the lies. Listen to the senior advisor to Mahmoud Abbas, who said recently that the conflict is between good and evil, good Palestinian Authority and Palestinian people, and the evil Israelis, the satanic Israelis. We haven't heard this type of language since the Nazi regime. And yet we're hearing it from the Palestinian Authority, these types of demonizations of the Jewish state that echo across the Atlantic, to Europe, to the United States. But it's very easy to fight against it because the source of it is so public, and all you have to do is Google Mahmoud Abbas and statements demonizing Israel, and you'll get the full flavor. You'll get the whole Rolodex of statements in Arabic, even in Hebrew, and in English. Mahmoud Abbas said himself regarding denormalization and radicalization of his own people that Israeli rabbis have called for the poisoning of wells of Palestinian water supplies. Well, isn't that an irony, considering that Israel and the Palestinian Authority just upped their clean water agreement, where Israel supplies even more fresh water to Palestinians by agreement? You may have heard the statements of the Olympic Committee chairman, Jabil Rajoub. What did he just say over the last couple of years? The Minister of Sport for the Palestinian Authority says to the international community that any cooperation in sports with the Zionist enemy is a crime against humanity. That's the type of incitement to violence and murder and demonization type of language that you can hear from the Palestinian leadership itself. And in fact, some of the greatest victims of denormalization are the Palestinian people. In Judea and Samaria, what they call the former West Bank of Jordan, in parts of Jerusalem, because, and here's the big secret, here's the big disconnect when we talk about denormalization and the Palestinian victims, the men and women who work every day, who take their children to school, and who pick them up, who provide for their large families. Here's the secret. The BDS movement and the denormalization weaponry and warfare have nothing to do with what the Palestinian people, the public on the ground, want. The research that we at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs have been conducting over the last 2 years shows, incontrovertibly, that the Palestinian public doesn't know what BDS is. And when they may have heard of the concept of boycotts, they're disinterested. I can tell you from conversations with leaders in Palestinian cities like Hussan, Palestinian-controlled parts of Hebron, in small villages that I prefer not to name specifically because they can end up in jail if I were to mention them, and they have ended up in jail in the whole Gush Etzion area just south of Jerusalem, is that they want Israel. They want to work with Israel. They want to work with Israelis. They want to cooperate economically. And they use a term in Arabic called ta'awun. Ta'awun. It means cooperation. It means cooperation face-to-face. They say in Hebrew, gova einai, meaning one opposite the other. The same, literally the same height. Mutual respect is what it really means. And that's what Palestinians on the ground in the West Bank are saying. And so those who make decisions in the United States, in Congress, in the Senate, Jewish leadership, NGO leadership, need to understand that if they want to help the Palestinians, they need to follow their lead, because what they're saying is that we want to work with our Israeli neighbor. They understand what Startup Nation is. How do we know that? Because if you go on a day trip to SodaStream, the international company that's traded on the American Stock Exchange, on the New York Stock Exchange, you will see harmony, peace, and prosperity being shared by Palestinians and Israelis together. Get this, Palestinian managers, Jewish workers. Jewish managers, Palestinian workers. In other words, what Daniel Birnbaum, the American-born Israeli CEO, entrepreneur, has succeeded to do is to employ Palestinians and Israelis together of every possible background. Russians, Druze, Bedouins, Sunni Palestinian Muslims, and even Darfurians, all working together in complete equality, protected by Israeli labor law. Everyone together. And so when you ask them what it is they want, they certainly don't talk about denormalization. In fact, I have just heard recently very strong statements made by Palestinian managers and workers against denormalization and against BDS and even against the Palestinian Authority leadership. They are saying, like the US Congress is saying, enough is enough. There are today 30,000 Palestinians working in 15 industrial zones throughout the West Bank and in Jerusalem. And those workers, Palestinians and Israelis both, Jews, Muslims, Bedouins, and others, Circassians, are all paid the same rate, and that rate is 3.5 times what any Palestinian worker would make in the Palestinian-controlled areas. And the same thing goes at a place called Rami Levy. Rami Levy, the greatest supermarket entrepreneur in Israel, has started and expanded and established superstores, supermarket superstores, all across the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, including very close to where we are today. And he employs thousands of Palestinians who are similarly protected by Israeli labor laws, who work in harmony and prosperity and equality together with their Israeli co-workers. So the message for today is that both the US Congress and Palestinians on the ground are saying to the Palestinian leadership and the NGOs in Ramallah, hey guys, enough is enough. It's time for mutual embrace, for economic peace, for cooperation, ta'awun, as they say in Arabic, and it is time to shelve and not only shelve, but upend and uproot and unmask and even prosecute those who are promoting the dangerous and violent denormalization movement whose intention is to kill peace, while Palestinians and Israelis on the ground are doing everything they can to embrace peace, to promote good neighborly relations, and as Democrats would say, with a small d, follow the voice of the people. The voice of the people are saying, we want to work together in peace, harmony, and prosperity. Thank you.